So good evening and welcome to another Archway Reading and Lecture Series event at the University of Dubuque. I'd like to welcome any Streamlines Conference attendees who are joining us this evening, and we look forward to hosting the conference tomorrow. Quickly, I'd just like to thank the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Department of Language and Literature for their continued support of this reading series. As some of you know, Abby Jeannie, who was supposed to read this evening, unfortunately could not attend due to illness, but we've got a more than worthy pinch hitter stepping in to read and answer any questions you might have this evening in Austin Smith. Before I introduce Austin, just a quick note that he does have a few books for sale if you'd like to pick one up after the reading, or if you have any questions you're too embarrassed to ask in front of people, I'm sure you can catch him, up here. So anyway, Austin Smith grew up on a family dairy farm in northwestern Illinois. He received a BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an MA from the University of California, Davis, and an MFA from the University of Virginia. He has published 3 poetry chapbooks, In the Silence of the Migrated Birds, Wheat and Distance, and Instructions for How to Put an Old Horse Down. His full-length collections, ALMANAC and FLYOVER COUNTry, were both published through the Princeton series of contemporary poets. His poems have appeared in places like The New Yorker, Poetry Magazine, Yale Review, Ploughshares, New England Review, Virginia Quarterly, amongst others. His stories have appeared or will appear in Harper's Glimmer Train, Kenyon Review, also others. He was a recipient of the 2015 Narrative Prize for his short story, The Halverson Brothers. In addition, he was the recipient of a Wallace Stegner Fellowship in Fiction from Stanford University and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Prose. He is currently a Jones Lecturer at Stanford University, where he teaches courses in poetry, fiction, environmental literature, and documentary journalism. But he mostly lives in a farmhouse in downtown Schapville, Illinois. So without further ado, please welcome Austin Smith.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Janine. I really appreciate the invitation to read. And I was really sorry to hear that the fiction writer you invited had come down sick. I don't know if any of you saw recently, there was a concert where some people thought that Frank Ocean was going to be there, but it turned out to be Drake. And I kind of feel like the Drake to the Frank Ocean. And I love Frank Ocean, and I like Drake, but I feel a little awkward, that I'm stepping in, but I really appreciate it, and it's really, really nice to be here. I appreciate you all coming out on a Friday night. I didn't tell Janine and Andrew this, but I'm actually a little sick as well, as you can hear in my voice. I'm going to do my best. And I also told Andrew I live in downtown Schapville. That was a joke. Schapville is a village of 2 churches and about 5 houses and an auto garage. So there's no downtown to speak of. So I'm going to read some poems tonight, but I feel like there's some students here I would love to get engaged with you all and hear about what you're up to and answer any questions you might have about the writing life. So how many of you are studying writing or English here? Awesome. Well, I'm going to try to leave some time for you guys to ask questions, and not necessarily about the poems I read, but just about like the life of a writer and, how do you, well, I don't know if I can answer this question. How do you find inspiration as a writer in a very distracted world? I would love to talk with you basically about all those things. And as Andrew said, if you're too shy to talk in the Q&A, happy to talk to you afterwards. Okay, so as Andrew mentioned, I grew up on a dairy farm in actually outside of Freeport, Illinois, not too far from here. And I've written 2 books of poems. The first one's called ALMANAC, and I'll read maybe a couple poems from that book, but mostly I'll read some poems from my most recent collection, which is called FLYOVER COUNTRY. So you all have heard the term FLYOVER COUNTRY, of course, and having grown up here and hearing that term a lot, especially when I was living in California, I found it very offensive and condescending. This phrase referring to the Midwest as a place that's not worth much, but just passing over in a plane. And so what I wanted to do is take that phrase and kind of, use it as the title for my book. And so I'm kind of mocking the phrase and trying to kind of take it back. And a lot of these poems are about my love for the Midwest and why I think it's such a beautiful place. And so the first poem I'm going to read is very much from the farm that I grew up on. And this poem is about an experience my brothers and I had when we were kids, watching or trying to figure out where cats were having kittens. There wasn't a lot to do, That was the most exciting thing was when we knew that a cat was pregnant. It was like try to find out where she's going to have her kittens so that we could swoop in and, play with kittens. But near the end of this poem, you're going to hear another theme of this book, which is American foreign policy. So dairy farm stuff and American foreign policy, two you would think, seemingly disconnected things, but I try to bring them together in this poem and in this book. So this poem is called Cat Moving Kittens. We must have known, even as we reached down to touch them, where we'd found them, shut-eyed and trembling, under a straw bale in the haymow, that she would move them that night under cover of darkness, and that, by finding them, we were making certain we wouldn't see them again until we saw them, crouching under the pickup like sullen teens, having gone as wild by then as they'd gone still in her mouth. That night she made a decision any mother might make upon guessing the intentions of the state, to go and to go now, taking everything you love between your teeth. Okay. Hopefully we don't have to do that. I'm going to go back to the first book I wrote, and this is a poem I think it's appropriate to read in the fall. It's about football. I played football at Freeport, the home of the pretzels, by the way. We had a terrible mascot, the pretzels. So this led to the opposing team would say stuff before the game like, who are we going to twist up? Who's going to be salty, Well, I only made it in football for 2 years before one of my coaches took me aside and said, we all think that you should run cross country. Apparently because I was like running away from all, intense bodily contact. They said you should just run cross country. So I was much happier after that. But before I quit playing football, there was this phenomenon, I think, of pretending that you were hurt so that you didn't have to play. And so I was always in the training room getting taped up and getting, ice packs applied, even though I hadn't really done anything to get hurt. I just didn't want to be out there. And we had this great physical trainer. His name was Coach Chance. And I feel like he knew that we were just faking it, but he didn't call us out for it. And he passed away a few years ago, so I wrote this poem as a kind of elegy to him. And it's called Coach Chance. They were only boys, but in the aperture of their need, they grew, so they loomed in the door of the training room like men who'd been wounded in war. One drill deep into every practice, they'd limp in, feigning injury. Though these were the boys who were more deeply injured, who, at home, were berated for kindness shown to wounded birds, called faggot, had cigarettes put out on their straw-colored arms. Coach Chance taped them up slowly, winding the bandage round and round the unsprained ankle, the painless wrist, whispering the way one whispers to skittish horses to calm them, telling them, without glancing up, that they shouldn't practice, but should stay off it, sit it out. How well he knew these boys, who were all the same boy, come to him fall after fall, in a different unwounded body, bearing the burden of a different father's name, His sympathy was hidden, guised as gauze and linen, but he healed them all the same. I'm not choking up, I just have a cold. Okay. The next poem I'm going to read is, if I can find it. Andrew mentioned that I live in Schapville, and I live in an old farmhouse way out in the country, and I grew up in an old farmhouse. And I wrote this poem because I was thinking about how when you live in the country, you always have to be killing things or trapping things or poisoning things, or else you're going to get bit or stung. There are all these compromises you have to make to be comfortable in an old house. And I think that sometimes we think of the country life as being very idyllic and romantic, but it actually involves a lot of violence, setting mouse traps and ant traps and killing wasps and things like that in order just to get through the day without getting bit or stung. So I wrote this poem about that kind of the disconnect between the idea of the rural life as being very idyllic and actually what you have to do to just like be comfortable in an old house. And this poem is called Country Things. Some days, even nature seems sinister. Walking around the farm with a beer, seeking some solace after the evening news, you meet the cat you love, coming back from the windbreak, a rare songbird in his mouth. In the mulberry branches, the silkworms writhe in nests that, backlit by twilight, look like x-rays of lungs. In the pasture, the cow kicks at her calf and won't let her nurse, while in a seam of gleaming honey, in the oak that lightning cleaved, the queen daintily eats her offspring. In the rafters of the barn, the starlings are pushing the owl's eggs out of the nest, while the owl herself is out hunting. Going in, you nearly step on a swarm of ants, ravishing a butterfly, like pirates tearing a capsized ship down, its wings like torn sails. And the first thing you hear when you enter the kitchen is the snap of the mouse trap you set this morning, tired of being kept awake all night by their scratching in the walls. And so, you are met with your own small act of cruelty, your contribution to the whole. With a pair of pliers that are themselves always biting something, you take the broke-necked mouse by the tail and throw it into the darkening yard, never knowing that in favor of it, the cat let go of the bird, who was only stunned, and whose song you woke to this morning. So the bird gets to live in that poem. Allison knows my cat. She can attest to the heartlessness of this cat. Okay. The next poem I'm going to read is actually from outside of the Midwest. I had the great opportunity a couple summers ago to go to Barcelona. And I was in Barcelona one night walking home, probably from a bar, late at night. Anybody been to Barcelona? The Gothic quarter of the city is this really old neighborhood, and it's really beautiful. And I was walking there, and I saw something that reminded me a lot of something I might have seen when I was a kid after a high school football game in Freeport. It was just this moment where you feel like, yeah, the world is not so various as we often think. This image in Barcelona, as far as you can get from Freeport, Illinois, seemed very familiar to me. And it was a father and son, father carrying his little son, and it reminded me of when, at the end of a football game, when you see fathers carrying their tired kids back to the car because they've fallen asleep. So I wrote this poem kind of about that, and it's called Father and Son Barcelona. One day, many years from now, after your father has failed to remember your name, you will only faintly remember this night he carried you home through the streets of the Gothic quarter, your ash-colored lashes closing and fluttering open, and the faint scent of lather on his neck. Unfair that I, a stranger, will remember him carrying you, while he will die and not remember. And you will live, only faintly remembering. But to be alive is to be carried by your Father through your city and laid in your bed without waking, then opening your eyes in the morning. My brothers both have kids, but I don't have any, so I just write poems about kids, and they have kids. So, anyway. All right. I'm going to read a poem. Andrew just made these really beautiful broadsides back there for a poem called Cicadas, so I thought I would read that, and I want to thank you again, Andrew, for making those. So cicadas have always really fascinated me, finding their shells on trees when I was a kid. Again, not a lot to do, you know? The kittens, the cicada shells were basically the really exciting moments of my childhood. Anyway, I've always been kind of fascinated by cicadas, and so that's where this poem comes from. We found their shells on the oldest oaks, backs blown open where they'd fled themselves. There was always a moment before we touched them when we'd loom near enough to stare into their amber chambers, as once, in a hall of armor in the Art Institute of Chicago, I stared through the flanged hole the sword had bored. But in the shells not a darkness but a light, like that which I imagine seethes through the keyholes of treasure chests in sunken ships. No matter with what care we picked them off, they always left behind a leg or two, like the crampons of climbers who've fallen. Sick now in this city, far from where I like to imagine, the ones we never found are still clinging to the bark of the highest branches. I wish I could leave my body blown open upon this bed, for a boy to find, and carry up to a farmhouse, cupped gently in his hand so as not to crush it. Okay. I'm going to read a poem now in the voice of a spider. Anybody know what Ars Poetica is? Sorry to call on you. I'm in teacher mode now, so do you mind sharing what it is with everybody?
Specifically when you reference like a work, right?
Yeah, it's like a piece of writing about writing. So Ars Poetica would be a poem about poetry. So I was kind of thinking about what it feels like to be a poet when I wrote this poem, and so it's in the voice of the spider, but you might catch the connection to poetry. So thank you so much. The spider. It is loneliness that makes me tie little bows of silk to leaf, branch, blade, and blossom. I build my web for the company, not the blood. Oh, I love the blood, of course, a vintage in which you taste a year your ancestors knew. But it isn't blood that sustains me. It is the shiver through the web, like a doorbell tripping up the stairs of an empty mansion. I hurry over as if to help them, but before they can beg me for mercy, I am turning them like a spindle on a lathe, their cries growing softer with each orbit, until I can hardly hear them hum. Then I am lonely again, a poet between poems. I was trying to describe how we're only happy when we're actually writing, and then when you finish the poem, you start to hate it immediately. Pretty much, well, I strongly dislike many of the poems I'm reading to you tonight. Because they're done, they're finished for me. You know, I've bundled them up in silk. They're not alive to me anymore in a way. But so I was kind of thinking about how spiders and poets have that in common. Maybe Janine knows what I'm talking about. Maybe not. Okay. Since it's deer season now, well, it's not. It's actually archery season in Illinois, so you have to be careful walking in the woods. I was in Wisconsin a couple years ago. That's where my parents live, and I walked into a bar at around this time of year, and I had this experience of everyone's wearing camouflage, and this kind of, it was definitely a hunter's bar, and so this poem is about that experience, and it's called The Only Tavern in Hyde, Wisconsin, and there is only one. So if you're ever in Hyde, you can't miss it. It's it's pretty easy to find this tavern. When I walked into the forest of camouflage, faces turned, gleaming through the leaves like tin plates hung amongst trees for targets. In a moment of silence, the eyes darted bird-like, measuring what had wandered in. Then the forest broke apart into forms, voices. Hands emerged holding bottles. Bodies lumbered toward the bar, wreathed by smoke like a forest restless with fire. And the tree-sized men turned back to their game of euchre, torsos thick as trunks, arms the breadth of branches, fingers splayed twig-like, holding their cards like leaves, which they turned as if acting out autumn. And then I noticed on every wall the heads of deer, their glass eyes staring through years of dust at the men who had killed them. That's not supposed to be an anti-hunting poem. My brother's a hunter, and I respect hunters, and so it was more about that experience of walking into a bar full of camouflaged men and feeling like you were in a forest, basically. So, okay. I'm going to read a poem now called White Lie. And this poem is about Christmas and something my dad would do when we were kids that, one of those things that I think parents do, they don't really think very hard about it and what it might mean to their kids. They just kind of do it. And when I wrote this poem, my dad read it, and he couldn't believe that we actually remembered him doing this. But my dad is a poet as well, so we oftentimes, because we're typical reticent Midwesterners, we don't really share anything with one another. We kind of just obliquely write poems to each other and leave them on the table. And in the morning, I'm like, oh, great, my dad wrote this long poem about how he loves me but can't really say that. And then I write some crazy elegy for my father before his death, which is really awkward too, and he reads that, and then we watch football. Okay, so this poem is called White Lie. Christmas Eves, our dad would bring home from the farm real hay for the reindeer that didn't exist. And after we were finally asleep, would go out and take the slabs up in his arms and carry them back to the bed of his pickup, making sure to litter the snow with chaff so he could show us, in the morning, the place where they'd stood eating, their harness bells dulled by the cold, their breath steam, all while we were dreaming. I swear I believe that there were actually reindeer until I was 19. He really got us. I think I'll just read a few more, and maybe there will be time for some questions. I would love to talk to the students, especially, and anyone else who came from outside the university. If you have any questions, I'd love to talk with you about poems. Okay, I'm going to read a poem now that is unfortunately quite, I think, relevant to the current moment. This is a poem I wrote about a tendency that I think we have as a species to be kinder to animals than to one another. So this poem is called The Capacity of Speech. It is easy to be decent to speechless things, to hang houses for the purple martins to nest in, to bed down the horses under the great white wing of the year's first snow, to ensure the dog and cat are comfortable, to set out suet for the backyard birds, to put the poorly shot wounded deer down, to nurse its orphaned fawn until its spots are gone, to sweep the spider into the glass and tap it out into the grass, to blow out the candle and save the moth from flame, to trap the black bear and set it free, to throw the thrashing brook trout back. How easy it is to be decent to things that lack the capacity of speech, to feed and shelter whatever will never beg us or thank us or make us ashamed. I told Allison I was going to do this now. I'm going to try to recite a poem. It's very short. I'm not good at memorizing poems. I'm really amazed by people who can do that. I have a friend, he's a great poet. He's written an entire collection of poems that he can recite. He could stand up here without his book and recite his whole book. He's kind of creepily staring into the distance while he does it. I can't do that, but I did memorize this very short poem, and I'll talk about it a little bit more after I recite it if I remember it. Okay. It's called Men Aging. Men aging need something to tend to, a horse, say, or a garden. Otherwise, they tend to need tending. And that poem's really about my dad, he is a dairy farmer, and now he doesn't milk cows, and he's impossible to live with because he needs to be doing something at all times. And Allison knows I have this dad imitation that sounds nothing like my dad, but I'm going to do it. A little bit. He's like, well, I'm going to go out there and mow her up. Which means to go mow the lawn. And my mom's always like, just let him go. Just let him do it. He needs something to do. So he needs something to tend. I guess in his instance, it's the lawn. Or else he needs tending. So anyway. Okay, I'm going to read 2 more poems, I think. Is that all right, time-wise? Okay. This poem is, well, I'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards, because there's kind of a funny story behind it. It's called Film of the Building of a Coffin Viewed in Reverse, so it's kind of imagining like almost like the poem is a movie that you're like playing backwards. The little tacks that pin the satin in fall out like baby teeth. The satin passes back through its fantasy of becoming a prom dress. It returns totally to the silkworms in the mulberry. The pillow blows apart, and the down darts back into the plucked goose. The black lab swims backwards with the bird in his mouth. The goose flutters up into the sky and flies backwards with the flock into the north country, as the shell inhales the lead shot, and the shell itself returns to the oiled dark of the gun. The hammer kisses the nails back out of the wood. The nails pass from his white lips to his dark pockets. The screws spin out on the roads of brass, and the boards part ways. The boards of heavy ash lay stacked along the wall for a night. The hands of the clock over the workbench spin wildly counterclockwise. Come morning, the boards return to the mill and converge into trees that float back into the woods in search of their stumps, like the phantom limbs of amputees. They know which ones are theirs by the rings, swing up onto them and heel. The birds that were scared off by the roar of the chainsaw come back. The dead man gets up off the floor, and his broken cup becomes whole again. He puts it to his lips and fills it with coffee from his mouth, coffee that grows hotter and blacker. So if you're a poetry student, you might try this exercise of writing a poem backwards in time. It's kind of fun. Sometimes you end up with images you wouldn't have, ended up with otherwise. So I wanted to teach this poem to my students, but I didn't. I'm too shy to actually admit that it was my own poem. So I came up with a name for a poet who had written this poem named Rufus Cartwright. And I said, read this poem by Rufus Cartwright and tell me what you think about it. And of course, my students are like, it's all right. Like, I don't really feel anything. And I was like, no, like, really, like, look at it again. And and then I was like, okay, whatever. That's the last time I ever do that. That was really hurtful. And then at the end of the year, one of my students came up to me, because it had been published in a literary journal, and one of my students came up to me and she said, hello, Rufus. So she knew, she found it, and she gave me some shit for trying to hide the fact that I had written it. So the lesson there is to just admit that you wrote it, and don't try to make up some name of someone who wrote it. Anyway, okay, I'm gonna read one last poem, and this, I've been talking a lot about my dad tonight, but this poem is really for my mom. It's when I was a kid, when I was growing up on the farm, my dad was a poet and a dairy farmer, so to make up for the meager income that entails, being a farmer and a poet, doesn't bring in a ton of money. My mom was baking bread for a while. This was like, I feel like even before farmers markets or CSAs or anything like that. And people would come to the farm and just buy bread directly from her. And so I was working on this book, and I really wanted to write a poem that was a little bit more positive and not so depressing. And there's a lot of kind of darker imagery in this book. So I was sitting there trying to think of something to write an ode about. And I decided to write an ode to flour, because I had a very vivid memory of the kitchen when I was a kid being totally covered in flour when my mom was baking. So that's what this poem is about, and it's called Ode to Flour. I was feeling down and wanted to praise something harmless, something we don't necessarily need, but that I'm glad we have, and I lit just now upon flour. I suppose flour could be harmful if you don't eat wheat, but let's assume you do. Think, where did your mother keep the flour when you were a child? Or your father? Perhaps it was your father who did the baking. Maybe neither your mother nor your father baked, but they still kept some flour around, left over from Christmas, or because a neighbor had brought some over. Though why a neighbor would bring flour over and then leave without it, I don't know. Anyway, you can tell I want there to have been flour in your childhood kitchen, in a paper bag that gave off a little gasp of powder every time it was opened, which wasn't often. On the side of the bag, a girl in a dress tiptoed amongst hens, a wicker basket on her arm, and it was understood she was bringing bread to the sick and poor. Or maybe your family stored the flour in a glass jar with a wire lid that latched, or in a stoneware canister with the word flour painted in blue cursive on the side. Wherever it was, maybe you reached your hand inside every now and then to wonder at how something so dry could feel so cool that it felt damp. Or maybe this is the wrong poem for you. Maybe you loved salt. Okay, I believe I'll stop reading there and ask if there are any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So the bar scene,
Yeah.
that sounds very different than some of your other poems.
Uh-huh.
Is that something where you would immediately think that could be a great poem when you start making observations? Or is it all from recollection, like a lot of your other poems?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think when I walked in, I thought the only way I can kind of deal with the awkwardness of this experience is to write about it one day. Because I was, let's just say, though I grew up in the Midwest, sometimes I find myself in a context where I feel like I really stick out. I probably had a book in my hand. I love to read in bars. It's one of my favorite things to do. I was probably carrying like a book of poems into a bar where that just didn't happen. But I can watch the Packers with anybody. I love the Packers. So this kind of weird mix of like feeling, yeah, these are my people. This is comfortable for me. This is the Midwest. I know these bars, but also that feeling of being the observer and being like, well, yeah, clearly I'm going to write about this. I think any of us who are poets feel that way. You feel part of the world and also somewhat like a spy in it. Like, you know, having a dad who's a poet is kind of helpful because my family understands, but oftentimes something will happen, they'll be like, oh, Austin's going to write about this. And so I weirdly feel almost like an embedded spy in my own life. And that wasn't really answering your question, I guess. But it's something about the scene, the fact that everybody was in camouflage and that there really was this almost optical illusion of it took me a moment to like figure out where the people were because everyone was so densely packed and everybody was wearing camo. This feeling of like, is this a forest or a group of people?
So it's like an aha moment at the time.
Yeah,
And you
yeah.
start then looking around like the deer's eyes, looking down at you killed them.
Well, I don't know if I knew that at the moment. So at the end of a poem is those of you who write poems are usually they're the best when they surprise you. And I think Robert Frost said, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. And he also said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. So this feeling of like, if I know what the poem is gonna, this sounds pretentious, I guess, but I really say it with all earnestness. Like, I know that the poem is good if it surprises me at the end. Like the poem that I read about the cruelty in a house, in a farmhouse. I didn't really realize that the cat was gonna let go of the bird until I wrote that line. And that those are the poems that really excite me. So yeah, I think I knew it was a poetic situation. I don't think I had the image of the dust in the glass eyes of the deer until I was actually writing. So it's a really good question. Kind of a mix, I think, of what you're suggesting. So thank you so much, though, for the question. Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned earlier you don't like a lot of the poems you've written, usually after you've written them. So when do you know that a poem is finished?
I think those two things are kind of connected. I think that when it starts to feel like there's nothing I can really, to continue to engage in it is only going to weaken it. It's kind of like, when you hold two magnets, they're attracting each other. If you hold them too far apart, there's nothing. They're too far apart. Maybe like in the realm of physics, they're still attracting each other, but you don't feel it. And if they're literally touching each other, that's not fun either. They're just touching each other. But that fuzzy zone where they're kind of tugging at each other, that's where I like to end a poem. That feeling of like, I could take this further, but it's mysterious to me yet, and I don't know, I don't quite get it. Maybe that's why I say I don't like them, because I don't really understand them. I'm not confident that they're good or that they deserve to be in the book, and that's probably why they're in there. And they're still alive in a way. They intimidate me. Does that make any sense? I mean, they're not, I don't feel like I totally understand them, and that makes me anxious, and that's maybe why I don't like them. They're hanging around, and I'm like, I don't know about you, man. I don't know what's going on yet. And sometimes people will read the poems and see something in them that I never saw, and that's really exciting to me because that means they still have a lot of life in them, and I don't completely get them yet. So I think that quitting just before you I think when I was a younger poet, I would keep writing past the ending and try to like pin it down and really, convince the reader of what I was saying. And I think that I've learned recently that to kind of end at that place where they're still alive is the best approach. So it's a really good question, though. I hope that was helpful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So what are the best and worst things about being a poet?
The worst is definitely the poverty. It's not a stereotype, right? Well, I have two very successful brothers. One's a lawyer and one's a doctor. So it's like a bad joke, I made up. Do you want to hear a joke? Okay. It's terrible. A doctor and a poet walk into the bar. The lawyer passes it. And then in the bar, the doctor buys all the drinks for the poet. So it's a joke that my family doesn't find funny either. But I think that so back to your question, which is a really good question. The worst thing about being a poet is being embarrassed about it. There's some embarrassment there. Like you care about, these things that one ought not to care about at a certain age, and you should have grown out of that by now. And I used to be asked, how are you going to make money writing poems? People would ask me that, like uncles are really good at that question. Always an uncle. Uncle John. There's always an Uncle John who's like, how are you going to make any money writing poems? And at first I would be like, yeah, like Uncle John, you're right. I should have considered that. Like, I'm sorry. But then I was like, man, fuck that. I'm not going to be embarrassed anymore. And so then I started saying to Uncle John, okay, Uncle John, let me ask you a question. How are you going to make any poems writing money? And then he would get so confused that he would just like leave me alone, So you just turn it back on him and you just say, wait, I'm proud of this. I'm not going to be embarrassed about it anymore. One of the things, because I teach undergrads, there's a real kind of like hesitancy to study English or to study poetry, especially in times where we feel very anxious about the economy and what we're going to do for a living. And I feel like people are really embarrassed about or like nervous about that. How is this going to get me a job? But I think in college, it's actually like the best time to kind of just like do what you enjoy. And so I don't know. I think that the answer to your question is like the worst of it is the kind of joking about money and actually the pretty legitimate like difficulties one has making a living as a poet. But that's also in a way kind of the blessing of it all. There's nothing really. You get to kind of be like, okay, I know that like technically this isn't resulting in a very substantial or consistent income in a way that gives you a lot of freedom. Maybe that's me just trying to be really optimistic about it. But that's a great question. So thanks so much. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So how did your dairy farmer dad end up a poet? Or how did your poet dad end up a farmer?
That's a good point. Well, I think he was kind of, in a way, doomed to be a farmer because we grew up in a family. Doomed is a dark word, but it was a family dairy farm. It had been in our family for generations. But he went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think that he had an interest in writers who combined a life of the mind and a life of labor, like Wendell Berry, Gary Snyder, poets like that. He was always reading those poets. In fact, I met Gary Snyder, who's a great Buddhist poet. He was one of the Beat Generation poets, knew Jack Kerouac really well. He came to our farm when I was a little kid. I came home from school and he was meditating on our couch. I was kind of like, that's weird. I don't know who this man is, but I'm just gonna make some peanut butter crackers because that's what you do after school. So I don't know. I think my dad saw his work on the farm as kind of being totally entwined with his work on the page. And that's what really interests me about writers who are able to find the resonance between literature and, well, I guess I'm interested in writers who combine literature and agriculture. So I think he was probably, as John Keats said, he had the poetic temperament, but he, because of the family business, became a farmer and never gave up his desire to write poems. So they kind of blended in this interesting way. And, that's a really good question. I've actually never asked him that myself, so I'm going to ask him tomorrow. Yeah, Jenny.
So I'm just curious, and if you don't like this question, you don't have to answer it. So I'm curious why you and your brothers decided not to continue farming, and I'm curious why you choose to. I mean, obviously, like the reasons why you love the Midwest so much are in your book, but why you've chosen to live in this region, especially you're not farming yourself.
That's real. Well, I don't think in the same way that I simply couldn't play football. I couldn't farm because, I didn't grow up like a traditional farm kid, gets put on a tractor when they're 8 and they're going to be there. And my dad really, really disliked farmers who saw their kids as a workforce. So he never let us help him on the farm. We would feed calves and we would rake hay and do that kind of stuff, but we never milked. And he wouldn't, he was very kind of controlling about that. He wanted us to play sports and work on school. He didn't want us to be farmers. And it was I grew up in the 80s when the farm crisis was happening, where a lot of farms were foreclosed. And it just didn't, my dad never believed that it was a viable future for us. And I think it's turned out to be, in a way, kind of true. I mean, farmers are really struggling right now. But I didn't have the temperament to be a farmer. I would have gotten nothing done. I would have been writing poems about the cow, and the cow would have been sitting there milk me. It's my dad had that halfway between farmer and poet thing, and I'm all the way to poetry. And why I come back to the Midwest is I cannot not live in the Midwest. It's so wrapped up with my identity. I've lived in many other places, especially California, and I always feel that phantom limb feeling, I should be back there, I should be back there. Part of that is because I grew up on a place I really deeply loved that my family had to sell. So I keep coming back, trying to get as close to the farm as I can, but someone else owns it now. So I live about 45 minutes away from where I grew up, and even that doesn't seem close enough to me. Sometimes I trespass on the old farm. I just walk around in the woods. Not during deer season. But that feeling of it's almost like you have to go back. I don't know, maybe some of you understand what I mean. I feel weird complaining about this, but the perfect weather in California really pisses me off. I want some seasons, I want some dynamism. Give me some, I know it's easy enough to say that, but I really do miss the Midwest when I'm not here. So for all of those reasons, I find myself here, and I'm happy to be back and hope to be back permanently one day. Right now I'm kind of going back and forth. Any other questions? Okay.
Well,
more round of applause.
Okay. Thank you so much.